When I was about 12 years old, I slept in a small, narrow lean-to at the rear of our family house, which was an old Australian weatherboard, and at that time was in serious need of work. It was freezing and damp in winter, unbearably hot in summer. Such are the weather extremes of Melbourne, Australia. As I lied sleeping on my side facing the wall, I would be woken from time to time in the early hours by the regular and rhythmical gnawing of a rat directly beneath my bed underneath the floorboards. Cunning Mr. Rat had found a soft and damp floorboard and was attempting to chew its way inside. I didn't really know what the sound was until realizing a night creature was attempting to get out of the freezing cold. And that was the start of my long fear and aversion to rats, possums, bats, and any other scratching, gnawing, shrieking night creature. A couple of years later, when the carpet in my bedroom was being replaced, a hole was revealed the size of a 50-cent piece. It must have been spooked by the old horsehair underlay and gave up. My adventures with the furry grey and white rodents continued into my late teens. At the time, I was mixing with a crowd that responsible parents would disapprove of. I would often visit another young troubled soul like myself who lived in a share house near the banks of a creek. Staying over one night after a heavy night of imbibing certain substances and sleeping on a makeshift floor mattress, I was woken by movements all around me. The roof, the walls, the long bare hallway outside the bedroom resounded with the sound of dull thumps and of running little claws racing down towards the kitchen. Terrified, I broke out in a cold sweat. I tried to rouse my virtually comatose friend, but he was out of it, somewhere in oblivion. I put my head under the blanket, but I kept on hearing them scratching around in the darkness. I eventually fell asleep and woke with the happy chirping of birds, just as the very vague grey daylight started to reveal itself. The rodents' excited activity quietened down by sunrise, and when I was certain they had gone back to their nests, I rose, grabbed my clothes, and ran insanely in my underwear up the rat feces littered hallway and out of the front door, jumping in my rust bucket Holden and speeding off, never to return to that house, that crowd, and that life ever again. The Yarra River dominates and influences the landscape of the city of Melbourne. It was around 1990, myself and my partner, at the time, were visiting her recently separated brother-in-law. I liked this cheery, slightly drunken fellow who had an important diplomatic role with the Australian government. He was living at a federal grain testing facility near the banks of the river, which was now abandoned and in the process of relocating to a more suitable environment, and for good reason, which will become clearer. We arrived at a brutalist structure with slot windows where Harry was holed up in a far corner of the building. We were welcomed by a bleary-eyed Harry at a secure site entrance to the building and were then led down corridor upon corridor past observation windows into rooms with lab tables and huge sacks of grain. His rent-free accommodation was an archive room of sorts. It had a single bed in the corner, a bottle of whiskey, and a portable TV on the bedside table. To say our friend looked tired and emotional was an understatement. He then started a rambling monologue of how they mostly come out at night and how he needed to jam towels underneath the door to prevent them from desperately squeezing underneath, which they did one night, one jumping on his bed, rousing him in terror out of a drunken stupor, then chasing down the rodent with a frying pan, nearly destroying the room in the process. When we left, the sun was setting. He took us to a window overlooking the yard where there were some old wooden shacks. I thought it was a figment of my imagination, but it looked as if the whole roof of one of the shacks was moving, until I realised it was covered by a carpet of grey with the glints of red LED-like eyes staring up at us. The last I heard from Harry, he had moved to a country town, never to be heard from again. The grey-headed flying fox is a megabat, or what is known as an old world fruit bat, and is the largest bat in Australia. Adults can have a wingspan of 1 metre in length and weigh up to 1 kilogram. An entry in Gould's Mammals of Australia, 1863, describes it as a grey-headed vampire. They have a long life and can live up to 15 years in the wild. In Australia, colonies of these grey-headed flying dogs have been coming to Melbourne for more than 100 years. Numbers have been increasing due to a loss of habitat in New South Wales and Queensland and the creation of a reliable food supply here. And one of those food supplies was right outside my front door, when from the year 2000 to 2010, I was living in a rambling 1930 Art Deco apartment building enveloped by a row of our neighbours' gigantic Moreton Bay fig trees. The fruit, being small and juicy, is a favourite of the bats, who would fly from the Royal Melbourne Botanical Gardens, where they were camped at that time, but now are no longer. And the story of their evacuation from the World Heritage listed gardens is another future fascinating story for this channel. It was the end of an exhausting working week at the height of a Melbourne summer, where the last few days' temperature had increased from the mid-30s to the mid-40s Celsius. And typical of Melbourne's manic depressive weather, it was about to turn, with ominous low rumbling black clouds coming in from the south across Port Phillip Bay. I was walking home from the train station and I'd had a few drinks. When I turned the corner to stagger the last 20 yards to my house, I was presented with the most gothic scene I have ever witnessed outside of a television screen, cinema or book. The Art Deco apartments where I lived loomed before me like a ghost ship. The boiling black mass hovered above intermittent blue flashes, tearing through and circling the perimeter of the roofline were shrieking and cackling bats, their enormous black membrane rings flapping feverishly. This was a nightly occurrence up until 2002, when 30,000 bats were forcefully removed from their decimated roost and sent packing to Yarra Bend Park in close proximity to a facility for the criminally insane. One beautiful summer day, I was sitting at my desk working when I thought I heard a baby crying, but there was something in the timbre of the voice which didn't sound quite human. I looked out the window to see a large cat bounding across the yard to the rear, hind quarter muscles rippling, in his mouth a large rat. I had seen this cat before, crouching low in the long grass near the front walkway. It sprung on the poor creature totally unaware as it desperately flung itself in terror within its maw, but the cat had it securely dead centre of its plump body. It was going nowhere. In a second, it was gone, to be taken back to its special place where hours of pleasure awaited and an agonising, torturous horror for its captor. My last and most recent experience with creatures of the night involved a ringtail possum. These marsupials are curious creatures. They usually make their nest in tree hollows, branches, and residential suburban roofs. At twilight, you will see these micro tightrope walkers traversing the power lines as they leave their cosy abode in the rooftop of some sleep-deprived family. On occasion, they make their way to a pole supporting the main electricity transformer for the street. On a winter's night, they will burrow behind them due to being nice and warm. Unbeknown to poor Posse and the sleeping residents, a rather high voltage surprise awaits. A blue flash and a bang, and it's all over. As a consequence, so is the electricity supply for a few hours, until some poor linesman is hauled out of bed to attend to the damage and dig out the crispy remains of poor Mr. Possum. So it was on one of these cold, wet nights when I was awoken at about 4 a.m. I heard what sounded like a tumbling and then a crash and a thump from somewhere inside the house. About 10 minutes later, I hear the running sound of hard claws racing along floorboards. I jump out of bed, turn on all the lights in the house, knowing too well a possum has made its way inside. After what seemed like an eternity, I managed to finally coax the poor exhausted creature out the front door into a breaking dawn. Now, just to note, I support the protection of all our native wild animals, including bats and possums. I just don't like rats.